Oi oi, long time no see. It's been a while since my last video, but I promise I haven't just been staring at conveyor belts for 2,000 hours. Well, actually I have. Factorio has consumed my soul, and at this point, I might as well start taking blueprint requests in my sleep. This review is going to be a deep dive, because let's be honest, if you're here, you already know this game isn't for the faint of heart. I love games where I can properly lose myself, and Factorio is like a never-ending puzzle that only gets more complicated the more genius you think you are. Oh, and for those wondering, the thing I love most about this game is exactly that. It's open-ended. There's always something more to optimize, expand, or completely overcomplicate for no good reason. I once came across a guy who's been playing Factorio for 7+ years, and he's far from the only one still obsessed with this absolute beast of a game. Now, feast your eyes on my 2,000+ hour masterpiece. Some might call it excessive. I call it dedication, or a cry for help. There's something oddly beautiful about the organised chaos. Watching the robots zip around, frantically keeping up with my ever-growing empire of efficiency. Speaking of which, I recently built a solar panel farm so big that I think I might be responsible for Factorio's first in-game climate change event. It started with a few humble panels and accumulators, and now 1.5 million accumulators, 1.8 million solar panels, and a casual 60 gigajoules each cycle. I could probably power a small moon at this point. What makes it even better is the community. It's insane in the best way possible. The sheer amount of mods, blueprints and guides people have created is next level. There are thousands of them, all making Factorio even more ridiculous, challenging and addicting. Honestly, the support this game gets is unreal, and I'm here for it. If you're new to Factorio, my advice? Build things yourself at first. No, seriously. I know copy-pasting blueprints is tempting, but if you don't learn how things work, you'll end up with a spaghetti nightmare that even an Italian grandmother would disown. Anyway, enough faffing around. If you enjoy this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and let me know if you've also sacrificed your soul to this game. Right then, let's get started and be kind. Yeah? No harsh judgments. I already know I've gone too far. Alright guys, this is the first base I built. As you can see, I've got a pretty extensive oil field. This was my first one. Oil is crucial for making chemicals, plastics, and a whole range of essential components. Some science packs are impossible to craft without it, so setting up multiple refineries and chemical plants is inevitable. One challenge I've noticed is overproducing certain byproducts, which can bottleneck the entire system. That's why I've added so many storage tanks, to prevent everything from stalling when there's no immediate use for heavy or light oil. Honestly, this is one of the few mechanics I find a bit unbalanced. Over here, you can see my uranium site. I only set this up recently, but at this rate, it'll probably last forever. This is just my second uranium mine in 3 months of playtime. Definitely more than I need, but I tend to go overboard with production. Better safe than sorry, right? As you can see, there are still over 7 million tons left, so I reckon this will last for another 4 months. Technically, my original plan was to use uranium for heat-based power generation, but I quickly realised that the real fun wasn't in generating electricity, it was in making atomic bombs. In just a month, you can produce enough to wipe out anything in your way, and let's be honest, they're ridiculously effective against all those creatures. Yeah, I know. They're the native inhabitants of this planet, and technically, we're the invaders. But look at all those ugly black dots on my map. Those are the craters left from the atomic bombs I fired left and right to clear space for my expansion. After about 2 months of this, I figured, alright, enough's enough. Time to be a bit more environmentally friendly and stop wrecking the planet. So I switched to my usual setup, which I'll show you in a bit. Guys, it's just so calming and satisfying to watch all these conveyors you've built, with all the metals flowing into the base. This one here is for copper, and as you can see, I have loads of them. all feeding into my megabase. I spent the last month rebuilding it, tweaking blueprints from the Game Tanks community. You guys are brilliant. But of course, I had to make my own improvements, changing things to suit my style. That's the fun part of the game, seeing all these flows come together, planning the rail connections properly, and making everything run smoothly. And the biggest takeaway for me? Always have your blueprints ready. For big structures like conveyors, junctions, and receiving stations, you need a solid setup. For me, the best solution was an 8-wagon station because the speed at which you unload your trains really matters. And when it all comes together, you get this beautiful, clean version of your base. Red, green, white, all these different coloured threads weaving into a complex system. Honestly, you can't help but feel proud when you pull it off. Well, maybe not proud, but definitely satisfied. I don't mind spending my free time doing this. It's just that enjoyable. Alright guys, I hope you're enjoying the game, or maybe you already love it just from watching. Whether you're here to pick up some new tricks or just to see how I do things, I hope I can share something useful with you. One of the biggest things I've realised is that you can actually overload your base. As you can see, I've got a ton of stuff going on, and the whole system is almost stalled. That's mostly because I've been making adjustments, which, to be honest, is the most fun part of the game, tweaking everything to work just right. But it's also the hardest part, especially when you take someone else's blueprint and try to adapt it for yourself. Rebuilding this took me an enormous amount of time. I've experimented with loads of blueprints and built several different bases. This is actually my 3rd megabase. The previous one was way too simple, more for beginners, and just didn't work for me. My robots and I spent nearly 2 weeks rebuilding everything from scratch, fine-tuning things, and getting rid of unnecessary stuff like extra turrets. So the key takeaway here? Choose your blueprints wisely. Not every blueprint is easily replicated, especially if you don't have the right infrastructure to support it. I'll show you how it works. It's dead simple. Just import the string, copy it into your base, and boom, it's in your blueprint book. Job done. Easy, right? Anyone can replicate it, no faff involved. Right, so the best and most useful blueprints I've come across have to be the smelters and overall designs from Ramzolga. You can easily find them in the Factorio library. Honestly, they're an absolute game changer when it comes to setting up smooth, efficient connections. Because let's be real, connections matter. If your system isn't properly linked up, you're just asking for trouble. Another absolute gem you need to try is the RHD and MK2 blueprint, also by Ramzolga. Mate, I don't know who you are, but you're brilliant. This setup is proper clean, tidy, and for me, hands down the most efficient part of my factory. It made unloading, loading, and smelting an absolute breeze. Before I built my megabase, I was testing out different layouts, and trust me, you're gonna need a ton of materials. But here's the thing, never try to build straight from blueprints at the start. It won't work. You've got to set up your own base first, even if it's small and scrappy, just to get a stable supply going. Once you've got that sorted, then you can start tackling bigger, more complex projects. For example, the smelter blueprint I was showing you, that was something I built before diving into the megabase. Got to start somewhere, yeah. And the second most important thing for all of you, rails. Rail connections are absolutely key, and a proper junction is just as crucial. When I first started building them, it was a right mess. I tried to do it all myself, but let's be honest, I'm no engineer, I just enjoy the game. My brain doesn't naturally work that way, and not all of us can design those perfectly clean, efficient rail networks straight off the bat. So my advice? Just give it a go. Test different setups, and once you find something that works, copy it and tweak it as needed. No shame in rebuilding if it means making things better. Alright guys, things can get really messy if you don't plan properly. But honestly, that's fine. You can build all sorts of setups without overthinking every little detail. For example, at one point, I decided I needed a proper oil base. Since oil is one of the key components in the game, you've got to bring it together with coal to produce a lot of essential materials. So what did I do? I found a few oil fields, 3 to be precise, set them up and connected them with a rail station designed for coal deliveries. Then I built loads of chemical plants and oil refineries there. Of course, I used blueprints to get the layout right, and at that time, I also started using some mods to help manage fluids. One of the best mods I highly recommend is the one that lets you transport much larger amounts of fluids through megapipes. That's an absolute game changer because at this scale, you don't want to be messing around with tiny pipelines. You need massive flow capacity. And as you can see, the size of this base is huge. It's basically double or even triple the size of my initial base. That's the thing. You need massive quantities of oil, copper, stone, and metals constantly flowing in. So don't be afraid to scale things up. Your setup should be big, efficient, and most importantly, easy to expand. That's another key takeaway from my experience. Alright guys, when you're working with blueprints, always remember, they're not originally yours. That means you're going to run into constraints and unexpected issues along the way. For me, one of the biggest headaches was setting up the railway system inside my megabase. I had loads of rail connections, and at first, they created a massive bottleneck. I built the system early on, but after a while, I realised it was completely ridiculous, so I decided to change it. That's when I turned to mods. I added a patch organizer mod, which basically lets you copy and paste resource patches. As you can see, I'm just copy-pasting copper here, grabbing copper ore, and organizing patches across the map. Then you can merge them all into one spot where you actually need them. It's incredibly useful. Now, I'll admit, it does feel a bit like cheating, but hey, it's a game, so why not use the tools available when you need them? I'm not saying you should do this right from the start. I only started using it after 3 months of playing, once I got deep into optimizing everything. So you just need to choose the place where you want to place the patch. It can be bigger or smaller, depending on how many conveyors you plan to use. The best approach is to place the conveyor first and then position the patch, and then voila! You've got yourself a proper patch with over 600 million metric tons, placed exactly where you want it. And that's the beauty of it. Now I'll show you where to find it. It's dead simple. Just exit the game, head to the mods section, and filter through to find the ones that might be useful for you. In this case, I was looking for infinite resources, and let's be honest, it's not a minor tweak, it's a total game changer. With it, you don't need to worry about resource depletion at all. So let's go ahead, add it in for this demonstration, and continue the game. When you're adding mods, don't worry too much. You can always roll them back if needed. The game checks for compatibility at startup to make sure everything works together. But here's where things can get tricky. If your blueprints rely on certain mods, and those mods aren't enabled or compatible, some of them might get disabled automatically. And that's exactly what you can see happening here. So guys, as you can see in this case, I've run into a lot of problems. Many of my loaders haven't been created, and you've got to be ready for that. These loaders are incredibly useful for unloading and loading materials in and out, but right now they've been flagged as disabled. Since I have a huge number of them across my base, this is a big issue. The problem is that they're incompatible with the mod I just enabled, which means they won't work at all. That's why it's always a good practice to keep a backup save and be prepared to roll back if you find that some mods don't play nicely together. So guys, the next vital thing for us is railways. There are usually a lot of options. Now I'm not claiming mine is the best, but it works well. I use a 2-in, 2-out system, and the most interesting part is the intersections. For example, this one helps you build an intersection if you need to connect something to the left or right of the main railway line. So in this case, I'm making the rail go left from my main railway, just to give you an idea of how my setup is built. I've designed a massive quadrant system for my base, which helps me connect everything: mines, factories, and more. Now, one of the most useful blueprints I use, and probably the one I rely on the most, is the expansion blueprint. This one is essential for extending your territory and exploring new areas. You can see how easy it is. I'm just adding 3 stations for the robots and don't forget to plug them in. Then, I simply duplicate them so they're all connected. And if you run into the sea, just press Shift. You probably know this already, but just a reminder, only expand further left or right if you actually need to. And as you can see, I've made a few new discoveries, new nests, new enemy bases, all the lovely natural inhabitants of this planet. These creatures just trying to live their lives. So, what do? Well, I'll show you. First, I need a radar. I'm using an MK10 radar, which is one of the best upgrades to improve the scan radius and speed up exploration. I don't like wasting time on this, so I always make sure it's done quickly. So that's another key takeaway. Never forget to add a radar. It helps prevent unexplored areas from blocking your builds. Without it, you won't be able to construct anything in those blacked out zones, which can be a real headache later on. Now, as you can see, I'm showing you my primary outpost base setup. Technically, building with just 2 sides is usually enough, but you never know when our lovely neighbours might come charging in from the other direction. So, I prefer to set up turret defences on both sides. It's more than enough in most cases. In practice, my outposts were never defeated or destroyed, unless something cut the power lines behind the base. And yeah, that can happen if you stretch your power grid too far without backup connections. And after that, it's just the good old copy and paste routine. So, in simple terms, you just need 1 artillery cannon there with a steady supply of ammunition. I'm using this setup with 8 shells. Before, I used just 1 atomic shell, but now I've settled on 8 regular shells and let it do its thing. While the radar is scanning new areas, if it detects any enemy bases, the artillery automatically starts firing. Usually, it takes around 5 or 6 shots to completely clear out a base. There is actually a mod that cleans up all the messy craters left behind by atomic explosions, but I don't bother using it. I just leave the craters as a reminder, kind of like a battlefield history lesson on what happens when you mess with my base. Before, I was running around like a headless chicken, exploring left, right, up, down, every which way. But as I said earlier, it actually makes way more sense to just explore in 1 or 2 directions, usually left or right. With enough experience, you start to realise that those tiny dots along my railway lines, yeah, those are all roboports, my factory's lifeline. And here's something I noticed. The further out you go, the bigger and better the resource patches get. Massive copper and iron fields just waiting to be mined. Maybe it's because the game's evolution is evolving, or maybe I'm just imagining things. But either way, I won't complain. Now, I can't guarantee this happens for everyone, but in my world, heading in one direction is the way forward. Literally. From my experience, you need to build receiving bases and foundries on both sides of your main base. At some stage in the game, you'll need so much copper, mainly copper, that a single blacksmith and 1 station just won't be enough. So my solution was to build 2 on opposite sides of my main base and then expand with add-ons like all these copy-paste conveyor setups, which as you can see, I have loads of. It's all about storage. In fact, right now I've got millions of resources stockpiled because, after my first month of playing, I learned the hard way what it's like to constantly be short on supplies. Back then, I was practically living off the grid with everything running on fumes. Now, I prefer to have everything stored in bulk. And that's where the storehouse mod comes in. It's honestly a brilliant addition to the game. It lets you store an enormous amount of resources in one place, and if you ever run low, just build another one. Simple as that. So you'll need an enormous amount of copper, mainly because you'll need a massive supply of green circuits. These first level circuits are the foundation. You'll use them to produce red circuits, then blue circuits, and eventually all the advanced components you need for progressing in science. Also, it definitely makes sense to build additional production setups for circuits. I have 2 dedicated setups that produce only green circuits, which I then move via conveyor belts. It's actually a bit faster than using trains for short distances when producing red circuits. And once you've got a steady supply of red circuits, you'll find that they're used for the majority of advanced items in the game. Only a handful of high-tier components actually require blue circuits, so you won't need as many of them compared to green and red. It's kind of like an Egyptian pyramid, where the base is always much bigger than the layers above it. At the very top, you've got blue circuits, which actually aren't needed in huge amounts. But they're also one of the hardest to produce, since they require so many other components to be crafted first. And that's why they sit at the top of the pyramid. They're rare, complex, and essential for the final stages of the game. So, in a way, Factorio is all about building this massive technological pyramid, layer by layer, until you can finally produce all the science packs needed to push toward the end game. But once it's all set up, it actually becomes pretty easy. At that point, it's just copy and paste, replicating the process over and over. Okay, now I'll show you the third most important part for me, something you'll need to figure out for yourself: the railway outpost station. For me, this is all about design, and as I've shown in my blueprints, I've got a setup that works really well. I actually combined 2 blueprints to create a square base with lots of roboports, which makes construction way easier for my robots. And again, don't forget to plug them in. If I find extra iron or copper patches, I just add a few more conveyors to the system. But honestly, if you build the quadrants big enough, they'll cover the entire area, and everything will just automatically integrate into the system. Now, here's a small but important detail. You can see that the copper coming from the top is getting blocked by the conveyor below. So what do? Obviously add a splitter, but if you think that's enough, it's not. You actually need to divide it further, sending it left and right to balance the load. This way, you're making full use of the belt's capacity. So right now, I'm connecting the belts from both the bottom and the top, merging them into one, and now you can see both left and right sides of the belt are evenly filled. It's a small detail, but it's something that's easy to overlook, and it makes a big difference in keeping things running smoothly. Another useful thing to keep in mind when building outposts is that 1 train per outpost station is usually not enough, especially if the outpost is far from the main base. So instead of just relying on a single train, it makes sense to group them together and keep adding more until you hit the full capacity needed for efficient transport. From my own experience, I've tested setups with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and even 6 trains at a single station. And what I've found is that 2, or at most 3 trains per outpost station, is more than enough. Any more than that, and you'll just have trains sitting around waiting for loading or unloading, which slows everything down. And now guys, this is the best part. Once everything is built and set up, you finally get to watch it all in action. It just works, automatically. At some point, you'll just sit back and enjoy the sight of hundreds of trains moving in and out, perfectly synchronized. And that's what I love about it. Proper planning paying off. Compared to other games I've reviewed, there seems to be no lag in railway signals, making it a really smooth and relaxing experience, especially if you enjoy trains and building. It's not obvious at first since trains come into play later on, but once you start working with rail networks, you can build massive depots. I've seen setups with 100 plus trains all queued up, waiting for their turn, and with the right planning, you can manage them efficiently based on requests. There are some really interesting systems for coordinating supply and demand, and it's not just fun to play, it's fascinating to watch. And if you want to add a bit of personality to your base, there's a Factorio mod that lets you use different types of coloured concrete. It's actually a lot of fun. You can colour code everything in your base, from factory layouts to train stations, or just make things look aesthetically pleasing. It adds a whole new level of customization and makes your base feel truly unique. For example, in my base, I use different colours to separate resource patches. Copper areas are marked with one colour, while coal is placed on black concrete. It makes everything instantly recognisable from the map view, which is actually quite useful. Plus it's fun to use, so why not? There are also some great additions when it comes to watercolour variations, making the world feel more dynamic. And to be honest, I absolutely love black concrete. If I could, I'd probably use it everywhere, but I've stuck to using it for coal, so let it be. Another great addition you might want to try is water patches. As you can see, you can build them anywhere using a water fill mod. Just place a pump wherever you need it, and boom, you've got a working water source. It's actually really useful for setting up water-dependent production without having to rely on natural lakes or rivers. Plus, you can even use the Factorio mod to colour the water, adding a bit of creativity to your base. It saves a ton of time, and again, it's just fun to mess around with. What's even better is that you can use the same water to pump it through massive pipes. Just make sure to set up both an intake and an outtake, and you're good to go. It's really easy to build, and it helps you move huge amounts of all kinds of liquids from one place to another without hassle. As you can see, I'm transporting around 700 to almost 800 units of oil through this pipeline, and it's absolutely massive. With pressurized flow, it can go up to 1.5k, and the maximum capacity is 7,200 per second, which is more than enough for any factory, especially if you're planning to build a big, massive one. But if you're building a massive factory, it's not surprising to see just how much smoke and pollution I'm producing. So for me, Factorio is one of the most satisfying and immersive factory building experiences out there. Watching resources flow seamlessly through a perfectly optimized system is incredibly rewarding. Take iron, for example. You lay down your conveyors and suddenly everything starts moving like clockwork, fueling your entire production line with mechanical perfection. There's something almost artistic about the way everything comes together. The clean, straight lines of belts and rails, all interwoven into a beautifully efficient machine. But Factorio isn't just about efficiency. It's about precision, problem solving, and creativity. The moment you step back and watch your factory run flawlessly, you realise just how deep and engaging the game truly is. It's not just a logistics challenge, it's a masterclass in automation and strategic design. Every decision, from resource management to railway networks, shapes the evolution of your world, and the attention to detail is staggering. Whether you're building a small outpost or a sprawling megabase, everything feels intuitive, rewarding, and endlessly scalable. So chaps, if you love strategy, efficiency, and the satisfaction of watching your hard work come to life, then Factorio isn't just a game, it's a must-play experience. Thank you guys for watching, and a huge thanks to everyone who stuck around till the end. I know this was a long one. I love long deep dives, not the short stuff, so I really appreciate you being here. If you've got any suggestions on what I should play next, drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks again and see you next time. Bye.